when you grow up as I did as a sort of child of colonial and post-colonial Africa with no real roots, I'm quite anarchic when it comes to institutions.
Benvenute e benvenuti a Senza mulini, storie di chiese plurali, che ogni 2 settimane vi porta in giro per il mondo a scoprire modi molteplici di vivere il cristianesimo. La mia ospite di oggi è Tina Beattie, teologa, è stata insegnante di Catholic Studies e dal Regno Unito ci racconta come è stato il suo passaggio dal presbiterianesimo al cattolicesimo, come ha trovato il cattolicesimo un luogo più accogliente in cui esprimere la propria fede e qual è il suo racconto, la sua esperienza di femminista cattolica all'interno della Chiesa. So, thank you again for being here with me. So I'll just start asking you to introduce yourself by saying who you are and where you live and which Christian denomination have you experienced with or are you involved in now?
My name is Tina Beattie. I was Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton in London, and I left that job about 4 years ago during lockdown. I still work independently as an academic researcher and writer, and I also write novels. I'm currently living on the south coast of England near a lovely little town called Rye, but we're in the process of moving up to Scotland. My parents were Scottish. I grew up in Zambia in sub-Saharan Africa. So in a way, I'm returning to my roots. And Scotland is a very beautiful country. One of our children lives there with his wife and 2 children, so that's an added attraction.
Wow, it's amazing. I didn't know you were planning to move into Scotland. It's wonderful. And I want to ask you, what has been your relationship with Christianity over the years? For example, did you grow up in a family which was very faithful, lived in a community, in a parish? Did you discover your faith as an adult? Tell me your story.
So I was born into a Presbyterian family, which is quite a traditional Scottish Christian denomination in Zambia, and I grew up in that church. We weren't a very devout family. I used to go to Sunday school, and actually, when I look back at it, I had quite a deep childhood faith. I then went to the Dominican convent school in Lusaka for my education. And although I wasn't Catholic, I think those sisters made a very, very deep impression on me. And Catholicism began to attract quite a magnetic pull on my soul. Eventually, after what teenagers do, I was an atheist, I was an agnostic, I was all sorts of things. And I drifted back into the Christian church when I had children. I've got 4 children now, adults. But then I realized I really was drawn to the Catholic Church. So a few months after the birth of our 4th child, I was received into the Catholic Church. And then it was not long after that, when our youngest child started school, we'd moved to Britain from Zimbabwe by then. And I had left school at 15 with very few qualifications. And I went to university the year our youngest child started school and did a degree in theology and religious studies. And I guess then I began to read the work of some feminist theologians. I got into trouble with the Vatican for my positions on things like women's ordination, same-sex marriage, contraception. And I found myself, really without intending it, becoming a feminist voice in the Catholic Church. And I guess that's more or less where most of my activism has been. Having lived most of my young life in Africa, I also retain a very keen interest in African women in the church, their sexual and reproductive health and rights, their faith, their theologies. So that's really where I am. A lot of my own theology draws on psychoanalytic resources, on Jacques Lacan, on Rigore, Kristeva, Siksu, because I think for me, the sort of liberal feminism that comes out of the English speaking world, so primarily the US, which is very influential, doesn't for me satisfactorily explore the really deep, difficult questions of desire, love, violence, altruism. It's not enough just to say, oh, the church is patriarchal or the church is misogynist. Sometimes it is, but I want to understand why. I don't want to just state what the problem is. I want to say, what is it about the female body that seems to be very frightening to many men and leads them to want to exercise quite violent forms of control, whether that's through rigid doctrines or through physical violence sometimes. So I'm interested in what lies deep underneath the surface of human consciousness to to make life as dark and difficult as it sometimes is, particularly from the perspective of women and girls.
You said that you find yourself in a conflict with Vatican and in a position that you have discovered being as a feminist inside the church. So I was wondering, do you feel part of a church or do you struggle with your relationship with the institution?
I'm not a very good person about being in institutions generally. I think when you grow up as I did as a sort of child of colonial and post-colonial Africa with no real roots and having spent many years actually bringing up my children in the home, I'm quite anarchic when it comes to institutions. I I just don't work very well in those contexts, whether it was an academic institution or the church. So the Catholic Church is my home. The sacramental tradition, the story of the incarnation and redemption in Jesus Christ. The Bible is such a rich resource of literature, inspiration, struggle, challenge. All this really matters to me. And I found in the Catholic tradition a reverence for creation, which is so important today, that to see the world, creation, as God's sacrament is to me really inspiring. And Catholicism gave me that vision. The Presbyterian church I grew up in was quite biblical and didn't encourage us very much just to see God at work in creation. And also for me, having been a Protestant, I had a very strong resistance to Mary. But when I began to discover her as a new Catholic with four very young children at the time, I developed an enormous interest in and devotion to Mary, not the Mary of plaster statues and you know, modern representations, but when you delve, again, I like to delve beneath the surface and see what's hidden beneath this. And there's a hugely rich tradition of Marian theology and devotion and art. So I feel very much part of the Catholic tradition. But I don't really relate. I don't relate to the institution. Really, I've spent so many years trying to engage in a critically constructive dialogue with members of the hierarchy. I've been banned, I've been disinvited. I mean, in a way, it's their job to keep vigilance over theology. And I wouldn't mind if I thought they'd read my theology and were actually engaging with it, but they're not. They're just gossip mongers. And they just respond to every sort of irritated conservative priest, as far as I can see. So I'm less and less interested in the institution. The church is a huge part of our shared human history. There are so many people all over the world who do amazing anonymous work among the poorest people. So much women and girls' education and healthcare is carried out by Catholic agencies at the grassroots. All these are really important to me, but the men in Rome, they can stay in Rome and I'll stay here.
I can say that I feel you very much in this. And I wanted to say I wanted to ask you, what is it like to be Catholic in the UK? I've done some research, and first of all, I was struck by how challenging it was to find statistical surveys that covered the entire United Kingdom rather than one or two of its nations. By the way, according to the UK Department of State, 46.2% of the population in England is Christian. England and Wales is Christian, and 45 in Scotland is Christian too, and 79.8 in Northern Ireland. And then according to the Faith Survey, which is the broadest survey I found, but dated back to 2016, so a little bit old, showed that 26% of the Christians in the UK are Catholic and 21 are Anglican, and then all of the other denominations. So what is it like to be Catholic in this context?
It's an interesting question because, of course, British history is very complex around these issues. So, and because we can't speak of Britain because the four nations are very different. So, England has an established state church, the Church of England, which retains a lot of its Catholic liturgical and episcopal kind of trappings. So after the Reformation, the Church of England remained recognisably Catholic in many ways, although today it's quite divided between quite strong evangelicalism and quite high Catholicism. So the Church of England is very influential in England. In Scotland, the Reformation played out a bit differently. And of course, in Northern Ireland, there's a recent history of religious conflict. But also, we are talking, unlike some European countries, we are talking about a country which experienced the Reformation, so that Catholicism lost its place as the kind of culture that I still see, obviously Italy is culturally Catholic, Spain, France, even wherever I go in many Southern European countries, I see strong cultural Catholicism, even if people aren't all going to Mass every Sunday. And in Britain, we are not a culturally Catholic country. So one of the things I find interesting here is that Catholicism probably is, for many people, more a faith than a culture. And that means that where there is commitment, I think it's quite a deep, quiet commitment. We do have many feminists in the church in this country. And by this country, I do mean Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. I mean, Wales is a relatively small part of the Catholic world in Britain, but so there are women's movements here. There are women who are very active at all levels of church life. But I think it's safe to say that certainly religion doesn't occupy the kind of political radical space it does in Britain that it does in the United States. So we don't have those kind of culture wars driven by religion. Our feminism is probably quite a lot more muted. There are campaigns for women's ordination, but I think in this country, because of the history, a history of persecution, a history of not having religious freedom until the 19th century, Catholicism is more careful, more muted, um, perhaps a little more discreet. But then, of course, we have large populations of Catholic diasporas from Eastern Europe, from Africa, from Asia, and those are often the most vibrant Catholic communities in the bigger cities in Britain today. So yeah, it is a difficult picture to just summarize. But as with all over the world, I mean, I'm in communication with Catholics in lots of different countries, and women generally, I think it's safe to say in this country, are as disillusioned as everywhere else. And that's not just disgruntled Western feminists. It's women all over the world. We did a survey. I run an international network called Catholic Women Speak, and we did a survey to submit to the Synod, which we had over 17,000 responses from women all over the world. It was in 8 languages, and the picture that emerged obviously had demographic variations, cultural variations, but by and large, it was a clear picture of the majority of women in the church deeply cherish their Catholic faith. They have a strong sense of Catholic identity, but they are very unhappy with the way the institution is organised. And I think that was a clear picture that emerged. And that would be as true in Britain as it is of any other context, really.
Yeah, there are the similarity, of course, also in Italy. A lot of women are not happy about the relationship with the hierarchy, with the Vatican. And so these are the common point. But of course, here it's different because Catholicism is culture also. It's faith, of course, but it's also culture. So hearing that in the UK, it's more faith than a culture is very interesting. And also hearing that inside Catholic spaces, there are a lot of feminists. Here, of course, there are Catholic feminists. Of course, we exist in this country, but at the same time, the feminist movement is outside churches, and there are very less and less feminists that are also Christians and Catholic in general, because the major religion between Christianity is Catholicism in Italy. So it's a very wide difference between the UK. I wanted to ask you a thing about your transitioning from Presbyterianism to Catholicism. You told us that you have this shift during your life, and I wanted to ask you what led you to become Catholic?
Well, as I say, early on, I recognised the influence of the Dominican sisters who educated me. They were strong, intelligent single women. And growing up as a Presbyterian child in a fairly conventional society, my world had no examples of that kind of woman, So I think they left a very deep impression on my young mind, but it took time for that to mature. But then we lived in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, which was a time of great flourishing in that country. It was after independence. Robert Mugabe, who turned into a terrible tyrant, was different in the years, or we thought he was different. I mean, there were political things going on which were pretty horrifying. But I think it's safe to say that Zimbabwe in the 1980s was a hopeful country. And I became very aware while living there of how much work the Catholic Church had done, both during the years of UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, when Ian Smith ran a kind of illegal white regime in what was then Rhodesia. And the Catholic Church had been quite a persistent, faithful presence for justice, racial justice, solidarity with the poor and the struggling, which continued after independence, and they were still a critical voice. So initially, what attracted me, other than those wonderful Dominican sisters, was quite political. It was about social justice, Catholic social teaching. When we were living in Zimbabwe, Pope John Paul II was, dare I say, a very sexy young pope. I mean, my goodness, the Catholic Church looked very attractive at that time. And I was drawn to it. As I say, I had 4 children, and I was nervous about being persuaded to follow teaching on contraception and things. So I made very clear when I went to see a priest that we'd made sure we couldn't have any more children. So unless the angel Gabriel came visiting, I wasn't going to be following church teaching or things like that. And he was very kind and understanding of all that. So I became a Catholic, primarily attracted by social teaching, justice and peace. And then not long after that, we came to live in Britain, in Bristol in England. And that was a real culture shock for me. I had 4 little children. As I say, I hadn't had much education. And I felt very trapped. I couldn't settle in English culture. I knew very little about European history and culture. And it was my new Catholic faith that actually gave me a doorway into beginning to understand that. I could read the art, music, literature, architecture of Europe as a way of discovering also what Catholicism was. So that's always remained for me really important. But before I moved into the Catholic Church. I had gone back to the Presbyterian church of my childhood, but the church I joined was very evangelical, very literally biblical. And I tried to fit in. I really did try, but it wasn't a language or a faith I felt comfortable with. I just still cringe a little bit with the kind of Jesus talk. It was, I'll tell you a little story that when I was in that church, my husband was also a bit uncomfortable because they were always praying for him to be saved. And that didn't make him feel very comfortable. He tolerates my faith, but he's not a kind of active Christian in any sense. And then I became a Catholic and we moved to the UK and he started playing cricket for the parish. And he said to me, "Oh, I so like you being a Catholic because when you were an evangelical, I had to do something to be saved." He said, "Now all I have to do is join the parish cricket team and they all know I'm saved." So paradoxically, from the outside looking in, Catholicism is strict, dogmatic, doctrinaire, but actually, when you move inside, sure, they like to sit in Rome and chunter on about their rules, but really, who's listening? I mean, all the statistics show that in Catholic countries, there are statistically as many abortions as there are in secular societies. More than 90% of Catholics use some form of contraception, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think paradoxically for me, there is far more freedom within the Catholic Church than I found within a church where everybody was an infallible authority on the Bible. And yeah, I found that very restrictive. So here we are. I'm a messy Catholic and I'm a marginal Catholic. And ecumenism is very important to me. You know, I work all the time across the board. And of course, here in the Church of England, we have women priests and bishops. Um, the Church of England has its own problems. That doesn't solve all the problems. You know, we mustn't be naive about the difference it would make to have women priests because the struggles go on. But even so, there is a healthy ecumenical um, movement in this country and also interfaith. I mean, at the moment, because I live in a fairly remote part of the country, I haven't been very active in interfaith for a few years. But when I was teaching in a university, you know, we had a lot of Muslim students, we had a lot of Black Pentecostal students. It was a very vibrant atmosphere. So I work across borders, but I'm home in the Catholic Church, if not in the institution.
Well, crossing borders is very a richness to faith and religion and society, so it's very important. The reason behind this project, Senza mulini, is to understand how Christianity is lived all around the world. So, what about parish in the UK? How do parish work, or at least in your area? And what role do lay people play? And what about women in particular?
That very much depends again on where you are. I have in my time in Britain been in a wonderful parish when we lived in Bristol and my children were at school. I was part of the parish that was attached to the school and it was very lively and vibrant. But to be honest, my work has meant I've been quite I move around a lot now, and so I'm not in a settled parish. And a lot of parishes are struggling. There's a shortage of priests, as we know. Priests are not always encouraging about really active participation. Women are, of course, involved. I mean, always. The world of parishes would collapse if women didn't do most of the work of keeping them going. Mm. And there are priests who are very supportive and encouraging of women's involvement, but I think it's fair to say that that's not true of the majority of parishes, that there's a kind of, oh, I don't know, maybe a lack of drama, a lack of excitement. And that's partly probably my fault, because where I think you get that is when you join things like the Jesuit refugee services do wonderful work with refugees. We've got something called the Pubblicata project that works in London for women who have been trafficked in the sex trade. And there's a lot that the Catholic Church is doing at grassroots for homeless people, for all sorts of things. And I just in the last few years, I suppose like many people perhaps after COVID, it's taking a long time to re-engage. So my engagements tend still to be at the academic level, and with sort of women's religious orders, which again they do amazing work, but they're aging and not always getting enough new recruits in the Western world to keep going, although they're often flourishing in different African and Asian countries. So it's a mixed picture, but parish life, I think, yes, women are involved, and many women are happily involved. As we know, not all women are feminists. But I don't think it's a very exciting scene, and the shortage of priests is a real problem.
Thank you very much. And last question, you are very involved in advocating for women in the church, as you told us. So what do you think are the most pressing concerns for Catholic women in the UK?
Mm. Um, I think they are the same as Catholic communities worldwide are facing. Dwindling numbers of practicing Catholics, a shortage of priests, a sense that some vital source of energy is lacking at the moment, and the strongest Catholic voices tend to be conservative, and people will say, "Oh, look, young people are so happy with conservatism," and I say, "Yes, but of the vast number of young people who could be in the church, who were baptized and should be in the church, that's a tiny, tiny proportion who are kept there by a very conservative form of traditionalism, although I don't think it is traditional. Traditional Catholicism is wild and woolly. It's not, women in lace mantillas crossing their legs and behaving. I mean, that's not traditional Catholicism, is it? Italians know that. So Britain, yeah, faith, I mean, the British are known for being more subdued than our continental neighbours, and that's certainly true of the way we express our faith as well, apart from those sort of African and Asian and some Eastern European communities that would be different.
Thank you so much, Tina, for being with me today here in Senza Mulini. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Grazie per aver ascoltato fino a qui. Questa è Senza mulini, storie di chiese plurali. Per continuare ad esplorare il modo in cui si vive il cristianesimo in giro per il mondo, continua a leggere la newsletter e ci rivediamo tra 2 settimane.